So, if you've been anywhere near the biohacking or metabolic research corners of the internet lately, you've probably heard the buzz. There's a new compound people are calling the Triple G Peptide. Its actual name is retatrutide, and in this explainer, we're going to dig into what the official research says and how people are actually using it. And this is the number that's making everyone sit up and pay attention. 24.2%. That's the average weight reduction seen in a major clinical study in just 48 weeks. I mean, that's a staggering figure, and it's pretty much the whole reason we're talking about retatrutide today. So, on one hand, you've got this absolutely incredible clinical data, and on the other, you have this growing online community of people experimenting with this stuff themselves. So that really brings up the big question: what is this stuff, and how on earth is it being used outside of a controlled lab? Okay, before we get into all the hows and whys, let's just start with the absolute basics. What exactly is retatrutide? All right, so retatrutide, and you might see it called by its code name LY3437943, is what's known as a synthetic peptide. In simple terms, that just means it's a man-made chain of amino acids that's been designed to influence things in our body. Now, it's super important to remember this is a research chemical. It is not an FDA-approved drug. It was developed by the pharmaceutical company Eli Lilly with a really unique goal in mind: to hit 3 different metabolic switches all at the same time. So how in the world does retatrutide get these kinds of results? Well, the secret sauce is right there in the name. It's triple-agonist mechanism. Think of it like a 3-pronged attack. First, it hits that GLP-1 receptor, which is pretty common for these kinds of drugs. That's what helps you feel full and slows down how fast your stomach empties. Second, it targets the GIP receptor, which helps your body get better at handling sugar and fat. But the real game changer here, the new player on the field, is that third target, the glucagon receptor. Hitting this one is thought to basically crank up your metabolism, helping you burn more calories. And you can really see the evolution of these peptides on this chart. We started with compounds like semaglutide, which hit a single target and got around 15% weight loss. Then came dual-target peptides like tirzepatide, which bumped that up to about 21%. So retatrutide, with its 3 targets, is really just the next logical step in that progression, and the results are now pushing past 24%. Okay, let's switch gears. We're moving from the lab to the real world now. For the people out there experimenting with this, it doesn't just show up in a convenient, pre-filled pen. Nope. The very first step is a process they call reconstitution. So the peptide usually arrives as this freeze-dried powder, which is also called lyophilized. And you'll see users online say that a clumpy texture is actually a good sign. It means the powder is nice and dry and stable. To actually use it, you have to mix this powder with something called bacteriostatic water. That's just sterile water that has a tiny bit of a preservative in it. And the user guides out there are really specific about how to do this carefully. First, you clean the vial stoppers. Then, you draw the water into a syringe and inject it really slowly down the side of the glass vial, not blasting it right onto the powder because that could actually damage the delicate molecules. And this is maybe the most critical step you'll hear from everyone. You never ever shake the vial. These long chains of amino acids are apparently really fragile, and shaking them can literally break them apart, making the whole thing completely useless. Instead, you're supposed to just gently roll the vial until all the powder dissolves. Storage is also super important. The unmixed powder is pretty stable. You can keep it at room temperature or even in the freezer for a long time. But the second you mix it with water, that solution has to be kept in the fridge. All right, so you've mixed your liquid. The next step is figuring out the dose and actually injecting it. And this is where you see a huge difference between what happens in a controlled clinical trial and what individual users are actually doing. So, in the official studies, they had a very strict dosing schedule. People started out low at about 2 or 4 milligrams a week. Then they would slowly ramp it up every 4 weeks until they hit a maintenance dose of up to 12 milligrams. This slow and steady increase is all about minimizing the side effects. But then, on the flip side, you get something like this quote from a user on YouTube. He says he's taking 5 milligrams, and he's calculated that to be 50 units on his insulin syringe. It's a perfect example of how people in this community are figuring out their own doses, based more on what others are doing than on a doctor's prescription. So naturally, this all leads to the biggest questions of all. What kind of results are people actually seeing? And maybe more importantly, what are the risks? Well, what's interesting is that both the official trials and the user reports seem to line up on the timeline for results. People often say they notice their appetite is suppressed almost right away, within the first week or so. But the really significant fat loss, that usually starts becoming obvious after about 2 or 3 months. And the clinical trials found that the peak results really hit between 24 and 48 weeks. Now, the clinical trials pointed to 3 major potential upsides. Of course, there was the incredible weight loss. But on top of that, researchers also saw a really significant drop in liver fat and much better blood sugar control for participants who had type 2 diabetes. But of course, there's a flip side. The most common side effects are things like nausea and other GI issues. And remember how it hits that glucagon receptor? Well, that can lead to an increased heart rate. Users also talk a lot about dehydration, trouble sleeping, and feeling really tired, especially when they're upping their dose. And, you will hear this disclaimer on pretty much every single user video out there. They're all very clear. They're not doctors, this is not medical advice, and it's all just for informational purposes. The message you hear over and over again is, do your own research. Which brings us right to the official warnings. Every single place that sells retatrutide is required to state that it is for research purposes only. And let's be crystal clear about this. Retatrutide has not been approved by the FDA or any other group for people to take. It is still an investigational drug. And finally, one more time, it is so important to remember that this explainer is just for educational purposes. It is not in any way medical advice. So all of this leaves us with a really fascinating question, doesn't it? Is retatrutide the next huge revolution in metabolic medicine, or is what we're seeing right now just a really high-stakes DIY experiment playing out in real time? The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, and that's the complicated reality of this incredibly powerful new compound.